All right, this video is going to walk us through some more nuances of termination, as well as kind of how do you terminate an individual session and some things that social workers need to be aware of as well on their end. So you don't want to do any countertransference when you're doing the termination process. So what does it look like for social workers and termination? Because we're human beings and providers of service become too attached to their clients because we're humans and we care and they've told us intimate details about their life. And we've journeyed with them on hard things. We also might experience feelings of loss that were discussed in the other video when we are separated from our clients that have been meaningful. I still have a lot of affection and fond thoughts towards many of the clients I've worked with because they played a significant role in my clinical development. And just, it's such an honor when clients let you into their space when they don't have to. Yes, they may have to go to therapy for court reasons or whatever, but it doesn't mean that they have to open up to you. Like, no one's forcing them to genuinely connect with you. So when they do, it is such an honor and privilege. And there can be a lot of sadness, like, because you want to know what happened to this person. You want to know how their journey continued. But just as we have to maintain that boundary for our clients, we also have to maintain that boundary for ourselves, to not stalk them on Facebook, to not drive past their house. I mean, that would be actually really creepy. But to have that termination in our minds as well. So we have to be able to anticipate the loss, move through our same grief reactions, and also have the space to reflect some of those feelings prior to the final termination. Otherwise, it's very difficult to have the energy to engage into a new relationship with your next client. Just being very mindful that like it is a two-way street, both of a relationship, that social workers might also feel the same types of reactions as well. So we need to anticipate and express those personal feelings either to our peers, to our supervisor, or other environmental supports when appropriate. Obviously, you can't disclose client information to some of those external supports, but you can talk about if you're having a bad day at work. It could be because you're, breaking up with a client or terminating in a strengths-based way with a client. You got to be able to put name to those as well, because if you don't, that also can kind of pile up towards burnout. This also gives us the opportunity to model for our clients how to navigate feelings with termination. So when it's appropriate, you can self-disclose to the client that you are having sadness around the termination process as well. Now, again, that has to be used ethically and appropriately, because that you don't want that to be interpreted in a different way by a client. But you can model that it's okay to have uncomfortable feelings or sad feelings around changings of relationships. You want to manage or practice your self-care, so being kind to yourself, not judging yourself for having those feelings, and doing stuff that kind of helps fill your cup back up, and making sure that you're abiding by the code of ethics following termination. So that's the section around dual relationships. There is a lot of guidelines and not suggestions, because they're not really suggestions. There's a lot of particulars about how to navigate dual relationships and how to prevent dual relationships, what entails a dual relationship. So, even though if a client might not be receiving clinical services with you, you can't engage in relationships after the professional relationship has terminated. You're not really supposed to maintain really any sort of outside of a clinical relationship with any former client. Now, the Code of Ethics does put a disclaimer in all of them that if you choose to, and it's not, I don't want to say clinically beneficial for the client, but if you choose to, because you do feel it's best in the client's interest, any harm that gets put on the client is automatically the responsibility of the social worker. So if you maintain a friendship with a client and you piss them off after your clinical relationship, they could turn that around and say, hey, the social worker acted inappropriately, and it's their word against yours. As far as being able to file a claim, and then in further investigation, you're absorbing any sort of potential harm that may befall the client by maintaining an ongoing relationship in any capacity. So make sure you're looking at that. It also has guidelines for social media. Like, you're not, during the clinical relationship, you're not supposed to utilize social media or the internet to search your client, and that kind of goes past as well, because that's showing dignity and respect for your client. I think I mentioned in the earlier slide, until you reach the point of acceptance in the termination, it's very difficult to muster up the energy and hope necessary to invest into a new client. So it's really part of that self-care, but it's also looking forward to ongoing practice. All right, how do we know when to terminate the relationship? There's a lot of factors that come into play when you're thinking about this. I think a huge one, because this is just kind of like objective, there's not a lot of wiggle room. If your insurance only covers a specific amount of sessions, your termination is going to be dictated by that. If they won't add any on after, even if you can provide medical necessity, there's not much you can do other than work with, can you do a sliding scale? Because I still think it's clinically necessary. Those types of things. But that's one of the huge ones to look at, and also talk to the client at the beginning of your therapeutic relationship. I think the natural one would be the social worker and the client have evaluated the goals and identified that the clinical relationship and the purpose of them working together has been effective, and the goals have been attained, and there's no longer the need for this level of acuity of services. So they might still have some ongoing symptomology, but they're able to manage it independent of the therapeutic relationship. You want to make sure you have case consults, though, with your supervisor, because they might be able to identify, like, if you have codependency, like maybe you're getting something from the clinical relationship too, so you don't want to end it, that they might be able to see that, yes, it would actually be very healthy for you to end the relationship. They go back to the client that I worked with, who showed me his lovely picture that he took of himself. I maintained a relationship, a therapeutic relationship with him, even after, so like I had started as a case manager at my employment. And then when I transitioned into therapist, I had to move all of my case management clients to a new case manager. Well, I could still keep some of them on my therapy caseload while he came with me. Then when I moved from the therapist position to a supervisor position, I still kept a handful of clients so I could practice my clinical skills. He came with me. Now, my supervisor was really suggesting against maybe like just raising my awareness, like, is this appropriate? Like, is he still receiving a therapeutic benefit? Is it no longer therapeutically beneficial for him because he kind of plays some games? And I think I had some type of countertransference going on, because like I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want to make him feel shamed, because those were some of like the common themes in our therapy sessions. And so I don't know that staying with him caused him more harm, but I don't know that I was the most effective provider for him, because he wasn't necessarily respectful of the boundaries, as you can clearly see. So she was able to identify some things, and in hindsight, I think it might have been healthier just from like a modeling how to end relationships perspective and like what appropriate boundaries are. But I also knew that I wasn't necessarily causing, he would have done this with another person. Anyways, that was a tangent. So supervision is good. That was the whole point of that. Also, apparently, my own personal therapy session while I'm talking through those things. So utilizing the systems approach when you're talking about termination, because you're going to want to look for things in their environment and external supports that are going to be able to help encourage the client in continued maintenance or progression towards their goals. And that's, if they have a lot of those supports, that does help move towards termination quicker sometimes. Lack of those supports might prolong services, just because the removal of your professional clinical relationship might leave them unsupported in their home environment, and then there's potential for relapse into whatever the presenting problem might have been. So what do we want to do? Sometimes the clients want to peace out and don't want anything to do with you. So some of the reasons why this might happen is the social worker might have actually touched on something that was really valid, but it was almost too much. The client wasn't ready to go explore that. And so them wanting to terminate early is their way of avoidance and coping with not being able to manage some of that discomfort. The client is anticipating the social worker leaving and wants to initiate it first because that helps them establish control over their situation. So I mentioned in the previous slide that I had moved kind of positions within our clinic a couple times. And so sometimes the client knew I was leaving, instead of like rolling out the termination, like, hey, we still have 5 sessions before I'm transitioning to a new one. Sometimes clients would be like, I'm done. They were done. They knew I was going to leave. They didn't want to deal with some of that discomfort of saying goodbye, but they also, that's how they were coping with some of their grief, because I was apparently the most amazing case manager and most amazing therapist that they couldn't imagine their life without me. So they wanted to establish control to kind of manage some of their hurt and anger about having to change. And also, client is taking flight from having to face any of the uncomfortable feelings that are associated with ending. So kind of that grief cycle. No one likes, I mean, some people might, but not a lot of people like to sit with anger or feeling rejected or feeling that grief. And so it's kind of an avoidance thing, which, I mean, clients have the right to terminate as long as they're not harm to self or others. But these are really being aware of them wanting to terminate early as an indicator that something bigger is going on is really helpful for us to know, social workers, because then we have the opportunity to process that with the client if they're willing, or reflect it back and able to build that awareness so they can hopefully then continue to have healthier relationships down the road. I'm sorry, I have like congestion apparently. So questions to ask if a client is requesting to terminate early. Have the goals been accomplished according to the contracted plan? Maybe you can still work on it. Can the client go on functioning at least the level attained at this time without continued contact? If yes, maybe it's not where they eventually want to be, but if they can maintain it, then maybe we honor their self-determination and let them leave. If maybe they've resolved their presenting problem, but they haven't necessarily demonstrated that they're able to manage it independent of the social worker's help, you got to ask if they have enough supports on their outside of their clinical relationship to be able to navigate it, or do they have the knowledge of how to access help if the problem presents again, and if additional termination supports are needed after termination, are they available? And I put on the bottom, always use supervision, because sometimes the outside person can identify some transference, countertransference, or potential risk issues. Because if you terminate a client early because they want to, and you haven't documented it well, and they end up harming themselves, there's a liability piece on your end. So that's especially very, very evident in like community mental health. And so that was the population we worked with, had a lot of chronic illness. They didn't really have a termination date. They just kind of were in the system indefinitely. It was unusual for a client to terminate completely from services just because of the nature of the chronic nature of their illness. So when we would terminate them, if they would go back and hurt themselves, we would get audited quite significantly by Network 180, who was the community mental health hub of Kent County. And so we had to make sure if we discharged a client earlier from services that we had all of our ducks in a row, because if they would come back and do something, hurt themselves, hurt others, whether intentionally or unintentionally, it would come back and look at us because we made that clinical decision to either continue or not continue. All right, I'm going to stop there because I haven't even covered termination of a session. So I will stop here and start another video.